In 1949 in London, police would find a partially dissolved human foot behind a workshop. Further inspection would reveal 28 pounds of melted human fat in the same location. Later, it would be found that these were victims of serial killer John Haigh, otherwise known as the acid bath killer. During his killing spree, he would target wealthy individuals, lure them to his workshop where he'd kill them. Following this, he would pour sulfuric acid on their corpses, reducing them to nothing but sludge. Before I continue, please consider liking this video to help it out in the algorithm. Doing so allows more people to see it since darker videos such as this have a harder time on YouTube. Also, if you enjoy this video, consider subscribing for similar content. One more thing, if you have a topic or case you'd like to see me cover, leave a comment down below and I will consider it. And now, let's continue. On July 24th, 1909, John Haigh was born in England to parents John and Emily Haigh. Approximately a year later, the family moved to Grandview into a 5-bedroom house. Unlike many other serial killers, John wasn't abused or neglected by his parents. Despite being showed love and respect, he grew up remarkably lonely. While other kids played outside, he would be forced to remain indoors. The family was members of the Plymouth Brethren, a highly conservative sector of Christianity so strict that even activities such as sports were not allowed. In fact, John's father built a 10-foot wall around their home in order to keep out the outside world. Even while walking to school, his mother would escort him, which turned him into an outcast. Later, he would state that he never made a single real friend at school. Around this time, his father, having a bluish mark on his forehead, told John that it was the mark of sin. He convinced John that if he were to misbehave, the same mark would appear on his forehead as well. This kept John in line for a while. However, later on, it had the opposite effect. The 9-year-old John began telling lies just to see if the mark would appear. When it did not, his bad behavior continued. Soon he was forging signatures and copying other people's handwriting. Later in his adult life, he would perfect this ability. Around the age of 10 or 11, John began to bully other kids that he would come into contact with. At one point, he would steal another boy's jacket, throwing it onto the train tracks. He would then tell the other boy that the train would kill him. Although the boy was unharmed, he would be afraid of John from then on. As he traveled to school, he would take the opportunity to expose himself to girls near him. Along with this, he would begin stealing from stores, never being concerned with the possibility of being caught. By the age of 17, John had left his school and transitioned through a number of jobs. Some described him as extraordinary, while others stated he was lazy and unreliable. During the next 8 years, he would job hop, keep an inactive social life, and generally keep to himself. Unlike his peers from school, he would only be able to acquire low-wage jobs. Over time, he would realize he hated working in general and would soon use his talent of forging signatures to acquire money through fraud and deceit. At the age of 24, he would marry Beatrice Hamer on July 6, 1934. Right before asking her to marry him, he would place an ad in the newspaper looking to purchase a car dealership. Once an owner approached him, John would negotiate a deal that gave him and the owner a split commission on car sales until everything was finalized. After this, he would forge a random buyer's signature, creating a fraudulent transaction for a vehicle in the dealership. Once the owner handed John a check for 50% of the sale, he would disappear. He would use this trick to purchase Beatrice's wedding ring. 2 months after the wedding, Beatrice would become pregnant. Only a few weeks later, John would be arrested for fraud. Later in his stay, his mother would send a letter telling him that his daughter had been born. Unfortunately, Beatrice gave the child up for adoption the following day. Later in the letter, John's mother would write, We all hope you rot in prison and finally find your way to the eternal flames of hell. Along with this, Patrice would file for divorce. Later he would state, "When I first discovered there were easier ways to make a living than to work long hours in an office, I did not ask myself whether I was doing right or wrong." That seemed to me to be irrelevant. I merely said, "This is what I wish to do." After his release from prison, he would get a job as a chauffeur under a man named William McSwan. At the time, the McSwans were one of the wealthiest families in London. William and John would eventually become close friends. After a year, he would leave the job and return to his criminal ways. This time, he would sell fraudulent stock shares. 10 months later, he would be caught again due to him spelling a name wrong. Soon, he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison but would only serve 3. While locked away, inmates and staff would later recall John talking non-stop of dissolving human bodies in acid. He would leave prison in 1940. However, within a few weeks, he would be caught stealing and sent back for another 21 months. Later on in the Lincoln prison, he would experiment with sulfuric acid in one of the workshops. In exchange for cigarettes, other inmates would bring him field mice. At his workstation, he would fill a glass with acid, dropping the mouse inside. Over the next few minutes, he would watch as the rodent's fur, flesh, organs, and bones were reduced to nothing but black sludge. John would make a mental note that it would only take approximately 20 minutes for this to happen. Then, he would calculate how long it would take to do the same to a human body. From here, he would dump the sludge down the drain of the workshop. After his release in 1943, the infrastructure of London had been severely damaged by airstrikes during World War II. The people within it were miserable and broken. Despite this, John was able to secure employment through Mr. Stevens, an elderly acquaintance of William McSwan. Mr. Stevens would allow John to live on his property, a massive 3-story house filled with expensive Persian carpets and leather sofas. Along with this, he was allowed to stay rent-free in this house for 1 year. John would excel at his new job and even begin to date Mr. Stevens' daughter, Barbara. Eventually, he and Barbara would make their way to a nearby bar and run into William McSwan. From there, William would invite the pair to his parents' house for Christmas dinner. It was here William would announce that he was being drafted into the war. On June 13th, 1944, a massive airstrike hit London. On this day, John was visiting William at his house. To avoid the airstrikes, the two would rush down to the basement and hide under a steel table. After the airstrike was done, John would accidentally stumble upon the ledger that William owned. He'd open it, seeing the insane amounts of money William was collecting from his tenants. A few days later, John would begin formulating a plan for the murder of his friend. Due to the airstrikes in London, property values as well as rent plummeted. This allowed John to rent a flat which was near where William lived. Later in August, he would buy sulfuric acid from a fertilizer factory, explaining that the solution was for cleaning. In the end, he would buy 20 gallons of acid, storing them all in the basement included with his flat. He would also acquire a pair of metal oil drums. On Friday, September 8th, William would call John, terrified of being drafted into the war. He'd received a final notice from the military, informing him that he was to report for duty the following Monday. William was terrified, especially after the airstrike. John reassured his friend that everything would be okay, telling him of a cousin he had in Scotland. The plan was for the two to drive to the cousin's house where the military wouldn't be able to find William. The next morning, John would drive to William's house, pick him up, and then make an excuse to drive back to his flat. There, he would invite his friend inside and tell him about a new invention he had been working on in the basement. Once there, John picked up a lead pipe and cracked it against William's skull. William's limp body fell to the ground. John would check for a pulse, finding that his friend was still alive. And with this, he would send another blow to William's cranium, this time ending his life. In order to make sure, John retrieved a knife he had stolen from the McSwan family on Christmas. Using this, he slit William's throat. He then filled a mug with the blood gushing out before taking a sip of it. After this, he would leave the corpse to bleed out in the basement, going upstairs to make himself a cup of tea. Once he was ready, he then returned to the basement and stuffed William's body into one of the metal drums. Here, he would douse the corpse in sulfuric acid. Due to the poor ventilation of the basement, he would leave multiple times to escape the toxic fumes. William McSwan's dead body would be left in the solution as it quickly broke down his flesh. John would then use the handle of a broom to push his friend's head below the surface of the acid. Next, he would drink the rest of the blood within the mug, then clean the basement with bleach. A few days later, John would write 3 letters in William's handwriting. The first was to a solicitor stating that not only did he have power of attorney over William's properties, but William had instructed him to sell them. The second letter was from William to John with the instructions to collect rent from the tenants of the family properties. The third and final letter was to Donald and Amy McSwan. This final letter informed them that their son William had fled to Scotland to avoid being drafted in the war. In the morning, John would drive to Scotland and mail these letters off in the city of Glasgow. Not long after this, he would return to London and head straight to the basement of his flat. It was here he would find there was nothing left of his friend's dead body. Just to check, he would use the broom handle to stir the substance around, finding every bit of flesh had been entirely dissolved. All that remained was the red-brown sludge and the smell of chemicals infused with decay. And with this, he used a metal bucket to scoop the substance from the drum, soon pouring it into a drain that sat in the middle of the basement. At the bottom of the drum, John would find small lumps of human remains. He would pour more acid on these lumps, scoop them out, and then use a hammer to smash them into pieces. These were also washed down the drain. Whatever remaining particles that were left of John's friend William would be washed away into the sewers of London. Rather than remorse, a feeling of authority surged through his body. On September 11th, he would hand in his resignation to Mr. Stevens. Throughout the following days, he would appoint himself power of attorney with the letters he himself had mailed from Scotland. Following this, he would sell one of William's properties for £3,500. Adjusted for inflation, the amount would be around £150,000 today. Along with this, he would collect rent from the tenants living in William's properties, keeping it for himself. In order to keep up the charade, he would drive to Scotland once per month to mail letters to Donald and Amy McSwan. However, by June of 1945, the war was ending. By this time, the elder McSwans were becoming concerned that Williams had still not returned home. Due to the military no longer drafting new soldiers, there was no reason for him to stay in Scotland. John was running out of time. Soon they would become suspicious of him. On July 2nd, John invited Donald McSwan to his flat, telling him that William was returning home. John continued on about a surprise party. With this, he made an excuse for Donald to take the city bus. The elderly man agreed to this, showing up at approximately 4 p.m. Somehow, John lured him down to the basement. At this point, he swung the same lead pipe that killed William into the skull of Donald. Mr. McSwan fell to the floor, blood dripping from his cranium. From here, John drove to Amy McSwan, telling her that her son had returned from Scotland. With Amy being ecstatic, she got in the car with John, who then drove back to his flat. Eventually, she would follow him down to the basement only to see her dead husband in a pool of blood. As she screamed, John pushed her down the stairs. As soon as her frail body slammed against the concrete floor, her neck snapped. At this point, he sliced open both the necks of Amy and Donald, filling a mug with the blood and drinking it. Next, he put on a gas mask and placed their bodies in the metal drums. Finally, he would pour sulfuric acid onto their corpses, letting the solution eat away at their flesh. He would then leave the basement and drive to William McSwan's house where he now lived. There he would inform Barbara that the McSwan family had moved to America. Along with this, he would break up with her. 2 days later, John would pour the remains of Donald and Amy McSwan down the basement drain. In the following days, he would forge documents to gain control over all their possessions. He would soon sell their properties for around £250,000 in today's value. Due to the family having no close relatives or friends, no one reported them missing. John deliberately chose this group of people for this very reason. Following this, he would be living an extravagant lifestyle, something he'd been dreaming of since he'd left home. In fact, he would soon be one of the only people in Britain who had a car. No one suspected he'd acquired his wealth by committing a triple homicide. With this, he would live in the Onslow Court Hotel for the next 3.5 years. However, during this time he had developed a gambling habit. By 1947, he was broke. At this point, he would see an ad in the newspaper for a 4-story, 6-bedroom house. This ad was put in the newspaper by Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rose. Soon, John would meet the couple at a restaurant. Despite the asking price of the house being £10,000, he'd offer higher with a deal that they wait 6 weeks so he could secure the capital. The couple would accept his offer. During the next 2 months, John and the Hendersons would form a friendship. And with this, the Hendersons would invite John to a party of theirs. At the party, John would steal their .38 caliber Enfield revolver. 2 weeks later, John would drive Archibald to his workshop. Once there, he would tell his new friend to close his eyes so he could show off his new invention. At this point, John would pull out the revolver, aim it at Archibald's head, and pull the trigger. The bullet would rip through the skull of the 52-year-old, exiting through his left eye. The successful doctor would fall to the ground, blood and brain matter oozing out of his wound. John would leave the corpse and drive to Rose, telling her that her husband had fallen ill. He would then drive her to his workshop. When she entered, she spotted the dead, bloody body of her husband. As she screamed, John let a bullet rip through her skull. With both their bodies on the ground, he would steal their belongings. After a few minutes, he'd have all Rose's jewelry, her handbag, as well as Archibald's gold cigarette case. He would also take a pocket watch and the keys to their hotel room. And as usual, he would also drink their blood. From here, he would put their bodies in the metal drums, soon filling them with acid. During the next hour, he'd work on both corpses, watching as the solution boiled and ate away at their bodies. That night, he would sleep in their hotel room, take a bath, and then write a letter to Rose's brother Arnold. Using Rose's handwriting, this letter would inform Arnold that the couple had made a trip to South Africa. The next morning, John would pack their stuff, pay their hotel bill, and then return to his own hotel room. Later on, he would return to the now non-existent corpses of the Hendersons. However, he had a problem. John had moved workshops a while back and this new one had no drain. With this, he used a wheelbarrow to dump the sludge in the back of the property. Unknown to him, Dr. Henderson's foot hadn't fully dissolved. After he was done, he headed back to his hotel room to find he had received a call from Arnold. Arnold was suspicious that his sister and brother-in-law suddenly left to South Africa. However, John would explain that Dr. Henderson had performed an illegal abortion on a teenage girl. Arnold would accept this answer, questioning nothing more. Around this time, John would resume his relationship with Barbara. Over the next few weeks, John would sell all the properties and possessions of the Hendersons, netting himself £16,000. Once again, he found himself a very rich man. Unfortunately, with his gambling habit, it didn't last long. In 1 year, he had spent today's equivalent of over £500,000. He was also behind on his hotel bill and in debt. On top of this, Rose's brother Arnold was now threatening to get the police involved. John would soon decide to murder Arnold to keep him quiet. Before he could do so, a woman by the name of Olive Durand Deacon approached him with a business deal. Olive, who lived in the same hotel as he did, had an idea for artificial fingernails. During a meeting between the two, John would go through her purse, only to find her checkbook. He would then discover she had a bank balance of almost £37,000. Adjusted for inflation, this would equate to approximately £1.2 million. Soon after this, he would purchase 30 gallons of sulfuric acid and then store it in his workshop. From here, he would convince the 69-year-old woman that he had created prototypes of her artificial fingernails. The elderly woman was overjoyed not only about her idea coming to life, but the friend she had made. On February 18th, he would pick her up in his Alvis Silver Crest. Along the way, Olive would tell him how happy she was that she finally got to work with him, explaining that she always thought they would make excellent business partners. Eventually, they would make it into the workshop. John would tell her the prototypes were in a box on a nearby table. Inside, she would find nothing but dust and a broken dream. Behind her, John raised his revolver and pulled the trigger. Olive's brain matter and pieces of her skull flew through the air. With her body falling to the ground, blood poured out and pooled around her. John Haigh felt nothing but the satisfaction of acquiring a fortune. Eventually, he would check to see if she had a pulse. From here, he would take his knife, slit open her neck, and allow the blood to pour into his drinking mug. After letting the red ooze slither down his throat, he would lock up his workshop, leaving the old widow's corpse inside. Then, he would travel to a pub called the Ancient's Prior, ordering poached eggs on toast and some tea. An hour later, he would return to his workshop and strip Olive of all her jewelry. After this, he would dump her corpse in one of the metal drums and pour acid on her. At around 9 p.m., he would leave and go out to dinner. The next morning, residents of the Onslow Court Hotel would become suspicious of her absence. After breakfast, John would rush back to his workshop to dispose of the sludge. With the temperature outside being 39 degrees Fahrenheit, the sulfuric acid was frozen solid. John would add more acid to the solution. After around 40 minutes, it would defrost. He would then use his wheelbarrow to transport and dump the sludge outside. After he was done, he would go to a jewelry shop, sell off what he had stolen from Olive, and then drive back to his hotel room. Almost immediately, Olive's best friend Mrs. Lane would knock on his door, suggesting they file a missing persons report. In order to avoid suspicion, he would accompany her to the police station. Eventually, police would suspect he had something to do with the disappearance and question him in private. John would go to the press, claiming the police were harassing him. The following day, they would print an article about this next to a picture of his face. Days later, the police would raid his hotel room while he was gone. Here, they would find evidence that he sold the McSwan and Henderson properties. After further investigation, they found these people were also missing. Shortly after this, they would enter John's workshop. There they would find his revolver, the blood-stained wall, and the dozens of empty bottles of sulfuric acid. Along with this, they would discover passports, ID cards, and other items belonging to the McSwans and the Hendersons. Most damning of all, they would find a dry cleaning receipt for a Persian lamb coat belonging to Olive. That same day, a jewelry shop owner who saw John's newspaper article would contact police. The jewelry John had sold would soon be confirmed as belonging to Olive. A forensics team would be called to John's workshop. It was here that they would find a broken coffee mug covered in dried blood. In the back of the property, they would discover the piles of sludge. At the time, they disregarded the sludge as being anything important. On February 28, 1949, the police would arrest John in his hotel, drive him to the station, and confront him with the evidence. During interrogation, he would ask what the chances were of him being released from Broadmoor, which was a mental hospital. The police would press him further. And with that, John would respond, "Mrs. Durand Deacon no longer exists. She's disappeared completely and no trace of her shall ever be found again. I've destroyed her with acid. You'll find the sludge that remains at Leopold Road. Every trace is gone. How can you prove murder if there's no body?" With a grin on his face, John Haigh would then go on to give full details of his crimes. Once he was done, the police would inform him that they would be charging him with murder. However, John was convinced that he could not be charged with this due to there being no corpses, citing corpus delicti. Despite all his intelligence, he had misinterpreted the legal term. Unfortunately for him, the police would inform him that a human corpse wasn't required for a murder charge. Corpus delicti meant only a body of evidence was needed. Later on, the police would return to the workshop to examine the sludge. Outside, they would find a gallbladder stone, 28 pounds of human fat, bits of bone, a left foot, as well as dentures. During trial, John would claim insanity. However, this could not be proven by any psychiatrist. With his trial only lasting 2 days, he would be found guilty on July 19th. The jury would come to this decision in only 16 minutes. That evening, he would be sent to death row in Wandsworth Prison. Barbara would visit him there, informing him that a wax figure would be created of him in the Chamber of Horrors exhibition. John would later send them his favorite clothing to dress the wax figure in. On August 10th, 1949, John would find himself in the prison gallows with a hood over his head and a rope around his neck. Not long after this, the executioner would pull the lever, sending John falling through the platform. Seconds later, his own body weight would snap his neck and end his life. That afternoon, his body would be buried in the prison graveyard. And so ended John Haigh's reign of terror.